Okay, so just upping the energy a little and getting ready for our next panel, which is a panel discussion on e-identity. And I had some little side conversations and did a little research, and I think I'm pretty excited to say that we have some varying views uh, on the panel, which I think is going to be really interesting for discussion and provide some unique viewpoints and some things for everyone in the forum to think about, because then we're going to ask you some questions about what you think. And one thing, if there's anyone in the room that's not very familiar with e-identity, I'm sure that most of you are. It's definitely something that is, some things are in place and some things are definitely have a lot of room to grow. So just keep that in mind. What I would like to do is introduce our panelists. So I've already introduced myself multiple times. Next to me is Catherine Mulligan, and I'll ask each panelist to say, before they speak first, a bit about them, so we don't have microphone phobia going off all at once. So Catherine Mulligan from Imperial College, and next to Catherine is...
You're not at Imperial College anymore, right?
Sorry?
You're at UCL now.
I'm at both.
Oh, you're at both.
And next to Catherine is William Skannerup from VeridenKey. And next to William is Alastria, Carlos Pastor. And then we have Hitesh Tewari from University College Dublin. And then I forgot Kai Wagner from Jolocom. I couldn't see you actually. And Germany. And then we have Elizabeth Renieris from Evernym. And then we have Rouven Heck from uPort. And I have to tell you, I spent a little time in the digital identity space, and this is really an incredible panel. So I really commend the EU forum for bringing these people on board. I say that with all seriousness. And now I would like to tell you what our introductory question is. What is e-identity, of course, in the context of blockchain technology, and where's the added value, which really fits into a lot of what we've talked about today, is, should we blockchain this, and if so, why? And these are really experts that know that. So I'm going to turn the next portion slide over to Ken, and he's going to explain some of the foundations that we're going to discuss.
Right, and so I just want to outline how we have framed the discussion and structured the questions from this for this panel. So a basic e-identity construct is an identity construct where you, as an individual or a moral person, have a set of documents or data that have some official value or some that you want to that have some official value. You need to do a few things, right? You need to make sure that those documents or data are certified by some kind of authority. You want to make sure that they are stored somewhere, whether it's in your office cupboard, your mobile phone, or an external data vault. And then you need to find a protocol that allows you to transmit a set of protocols that allow you to transmit those data and information to their requesters, and also probably another set of communication channels that allows the requester to confirm that what they're getting from you is authentic. So really, for today's discussion, we're going to examine each of those components of the ecosystem one after the other, asking questions such as, when it comes to the data, are there standards emerging as to how that data should be encoded? Are there standards and best practices emerging in terms of how it should be certified? And standards and best practices in terms of how it should be stored, transmitted, and authenticated. And I'm sure we're going to get a lot of very interesting answers from our panel today.
slide. So the first topic we're going to discuss, pay attention, panel, this is you, is personal data set, identity information, certified statements. And the question for the panel is, are there emerging standards in terms of data format? And framing this again, that we're talking about e-identity in relationship to blockchain. So I will go ahead and call on Kai from Jolocom to answer that first question.
All right, I hope, works great. Thank you very much for giving me this first opportunity to speak. So I'll keep it very general on, I think, how most players in the identity building space see that are also represented here in the panel. So what the blockchain identity space is currently developing, or what the kind of overall concept is this concept around self-sovereign identity. So I'm not going to go into the details of these kind of 10 principles and the overall discussion, but into the more kind of how the infrastructural definition of identity in the digital space changes to this kind of third development stage of digital identity. So we essentially decouple identity providers from their role as being certificate authorities and registries at the same time. And that is really what blockchain-enabled digital identity can do as a very basic kind of concept. So it enables you to register your identity yourself as an individual, as a machine, potentially as an organization, and then load trust onto this identity via different means. And I think this is the kind of general concept that everybody in the room will most probably agree on. I hope so. And then the devil's in the detail as always. So when it comes to standards, to just start off with that second question as well, I think there is also a very nice development visible around the Decentralized Identity Foundation, the World Wide Web Consortium, when it comes to defining how decentralized identifiers should be essentially kind of modeled and standardized. And we see a very nice development here because most big players active in the space and actually building and implementing solutions have currently committed to using these open standards. And I think to kind of bring a bit more plurality in this description, because I think there is shared agreement on this, I would also hand over to other identity builders on the panel to kind of extend this description.
So I think,
Actually, this was my mistake. Kai, could you just give us maximum 2 sentences about what you're working on in identity, just to give people the context of your background?
All right, sorry. So I'm working with Jolocom, which is a German company that builds self-sovereign identity solutions on the protocol and application level, so 2 different streams of how you can actually make this happen. And I also work in the German Blockchain Association in the group on GDPR and privacy, and also in the group on identity. Thank you.
okay, so my name is Rouven. I work at uPort, which is the identity solution from Consensus, and we're building an identity platform which uses Ethereum, the public Ethereum implementation as a trust anchor, but we as well allow that you can interact with smart contracts through this platform. So that's, I think, kind of one of the things we are a little bit different than others, that you have this combination of both. To the answer to Kai's comment, I think just to add one thing. So he mentioned the Decentralized Identity Foundation. So it's an organization which creates open source standards, or like just at least brings the community together to really discuss how we can build solutions which are cross different blockchains. So I think we came all and we work on different blockchains, and I think one key for success is that we need to have standards which can work across the different ecosystems. So there are platforms who build on the Bitcoin blockchain, on Ethereum, on other permission chains, and we want to make sure that this is all interoperable. I think this is one of the core ideas, and we gathered now more than 60 companies, in not only the small ones like us, but also Microsoft, IBM, Accenture, and others who joined this foundation, so I think that gets really good traction. The standard for data formats, which is often referred to as verifiable credentials, which is part of the WCC, like defining how we communicate this kind of statements about people.
Thank you, Rouven. We won't be able to let every panelist answer every question. So if there's one more person that would like to add any additional information about emerging standards in terms of the data format? Okay. Okay, if not, we'll move on. One thing I'd like to say about that, and could you say the name again, Rouven, of that organization?
So, yeah, so the data standard is like the verifiable credentials established in W3C. That's the standard for the World Wide Web Consortium. So all the browser vendors are in it. So it's a really like the biggest web standardization body. And the other organization is the Decentralized Identity Foundation, which is a foundation just there for basically bringing us together, communicating and discussing about like how can we make sure that it's interoperable.
And by us, you mean identity companies, entities, researchers, academics working on e-identity for blockchain specifically?
Correct, yes.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So now we're moving on to part of e-identity and blockchain related to storage. And we know that storage is really a key factor in this, and it's quite a hot topic. And there's 3 questions, as you can see. And so I'm going to ask the panelists to address those. I'm going to go to Catherine, if you could introduce yourself briefly. And I know you may have another viewpoint about self-sovereign identity, so if you want to briefly add that into the mix, that's fine as well.
Sure. Yeah, so hi, I'm Kathy Mulligan. I'm a computer scientist and an economist, which is why I like blockchain so much. And I'm at both Imperial College and at University College London, and that's where I do my computer science work, and then I do my economics work and policy work at Imperial. Because one job isn't enough in today's world. But so my thoughts are, I guess, like what might be interesting is some of the work we're doing, and obviously as a research institute, we're looking very far forward. We're looking 5 to 10 years in the future. We have a couple of things that are probably quite interesting. One is something we're calling Omni, which is looking at using user identity, not in a self-sovereign context, but it allows someone to collect information about their identity over time. So for example, if you take a healthcare example in the UK, a lot of locums come into hospitals and it takes them 2 to 3 weeks to get set up on any of the technical systems in the hospital because they aren't able to prove their medical credentials. So having this done on the blockchain would allow them to do that almost automatically. And actually in a lot of hospitals, they're currently just using WhatsApp to exchange medical information about patients. Because it is, so critical that they get the information around. So ironically, by having very secure systems, they've made the system totally insecure and given everything to Facebook, but that's another issue. The other one that we're working on is DataNet, which is where what we have seen about identity and data management is that we think that there are new protocols needed. We need to change the way that protocols are actually built. And I don't mean blockchain protocols. I mean, we're probably at a similar point now to where we were when we started the internet. So we're looking at building or rebuilding protocols that sit underneath the blockchain in order to better handle identity, privacy, and security at the actual layers of the internet protocols. And we also have a foundation around that because one of the things that we think is important is the ethics and morality that are built into those protocols. And that's one thing that I think is quite often forgotten when we're talking about things like sovereign identity, self-sovereign identity. What does it mean for social protection? What does it mean for labour law? All of these things are really quite massively important and I think quite often left out of the technical discussions. So that's me.
Did you have anything to add related to, I'm not sure if this is an area you're focused on, the storage facilities for e-identity, mobile phones, hardware, et cetera?
Not really, no.
Okay.
Yep.
So if one of the panelists who hasn't yet spoken would like to jump in on that?
Hitesh Hitesh Tewari from Trinity College in Dublin. So just to go back to the basic question, what is an e-identity? For me, it's a set of attributes linked to some identifier, and I'll go out on a limb and say it's an X509 cert or a digital cert, right? That's what it is as far as I'm concerned. So we've looked into that, and we've said, like, if you use the latest crypto techniques, such as elliptic curve crypto, you can have a digital cert for less than 1K. So if you had 1 billion of those certs on the blockchain, you're talking about 1 terabyte of storage data, right? Which is not a huge amount. So blockchains can directly store digital certs. You don't have to do it off-chain. Where would you store them for an end user? I think you'd store them on their mobile phone, right? Estonia is a good example, not kind of singling them out, but their hardware card that they had to kind of rekey around 700,000 of those. So if you have any sort of hardware, you're always vulnerable to some vulnerability being found in the hardware and being exposed to rekeying all those cards. So if you have everything in a digital format, then you have a much secure and versatile system. So that's what I'd add.
Thank you, Hitesh. Does anyone else, Kai or Carlos, William, want to address the storage?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, this is Carlos Pastor from Alastria. Alastria is a consortium of companies, small, medium, big companies, government, universities. We started half a year ago with 20 companies, and now we are around 270. We are building a blockchain, a national blockchain that is going to be available for anybody to use, for proof of concepts, for real applications. So we are going to collaborate in the infrastructure and then compete on the services. And the only service that is going to be included in the platform is the identity, because we think that is the base of all of the other services. And if we agree on a common service for identity, all the services could share the identity of the person to use the services. Going to the questions, the first and second question, we think that some of the standards are not mature enough. So what we decide is the technology should be able to adapt to any standard. So we include in the attribute the standard that is referring to. This for the normally we agree with you that this is going to be the DID format, but who knows? So we want to keep that open. And in the same the storage facility, we're doing the same. We are starting to provide the storage in the mobile phone, but then we are open to we will have an open API to allow the user to choose when he wants to store the identity. We think that this is one of the basics of SSI, to be able to decide where do you have your information. That's all.
Thank you. I think we're going to go to Kai and then Elizabeth. Sorry, I got all the names mixed up. William, I'm sorry, Kai. William.
Hi, my name is William Skannerup, VeridenKey. So VeridenKey is a very niche project. We're currently speaking to several nations across 3 continents, and we're working very closely right now together with the Ministry of Interior of Netherlands and Logis, who run their digital identity DigiDay. And we're focusing on creating a standardized digital identity that works across borders, outside of the EU, inside of the EU, and with all of the countries. So when we're thinking of a standardized digital identity, and because it's very niche, we're only focusing specifically on identifying the individual. We're not thinking beyond that as in university records or driver's license or digital assets. It's a very specific identifier just for human beings online. And when we are beginning thinking about how to tackle this solution, how to build it, we had to think about all of these different things, what make us us and what makes us unique and individual. And one of the things that blockchain was very interesting for us is the 3 pillars that we have all heard: immutable, decentralized, and transparent.
the immutable part that, you know, your identity cannot be altered or changed without your permission. And one thing we had to realize then is that, well, the data sets that make up us change. We as human beings don't change, but what we are intrinsically change. Simple example would be if you get married, your last name might change. So that can't be put on the blockchain because that needs to be updatable. When we're talking about transparent, well, today we're very transparent with everyone. We share our first names, last names, our jobs with each other, our nationality. That is something we share openly. But are we happy to share your birth dates? Are you happy to share your social security number with someone else? So that is one of the other things we have to think about. And the last one is decentralized, and that gets me onto the storage. Now, one of the things we liked about the consensus mechanisms in blockchain is that we could have all the participating nations joined onto one decentralized ledger, a blockchain, where none would have the ability to interfere with another nation's attestations of their citizens, but everyone would be able to see who has been verified by who. And that decentralized network really builds up the strength and makes sure that you have a certain kind of security, that you don't have a single database or single fault. There's not one place or one entity that holds more power than anyone else. Now, because all the attestation of verified identities is centralized, we also believe that the data sets that I was talking about earlier that can't go on the blockchain, that needs to be decentralized too. It would be too dangerous for one entity to have all of that access, or be too dangerous for one to be the full data controller. So we believe too, I'd like to say, with my fellow Palinists, that mobile devices are probably the best place to store it. Because if one mobile device is compromised, it doesn't compromise the entire effectiveness of the entire network, but only that one individual, which is a risk that we have to live with. No system is 100% foolproof. No system is 100% secure. So, I agree. Mobile phones for user data sets, and for more sensitive information, such as the actual verification attestations, we got to think of actual behind firewall servers.
Thank you. Kai, I'm going to get to you in just a moment, but first I'm going to go over to Elizabeth from Evernym. One of the questions we haven't addressed yet is, have any of these storage solutions been implemented at a large scale? And Elizabeth, if you could tell us about what you're doing and a bit about Evernym, and then address the storage, please.
Sure. So my name is Elizabeth Renieris. I'm Global Policy Counsel at Evernym. Evernym is a for-profit company that created the sovereign technology that some of you may be familiar with. That's now been gifted to a nonprofit called the Sovereign Foundation. There's also the Sovereign Protocol and Network, and these terms are often used loosely, so I'll try and be very specific in my comments. But as policy counsel, I'm basically focused on legal and regulatory issues around the world. Many of them are coming from the EU, of course, and so that's part of my participation in this working group. In terms of the storage question in particular, the way that Evernym approaches it through the use of the sovereign technology is through something called the edge chain. So ironically, a lot of these companies operating in the blockchain ecosystem are actually trying to de-emphasize the blockchain or the ledger, and are actually building different pieces of technology that either sit on top of the blockchain or the ledger, or interface with the blockchain or ledger in different ways. So the three pieces of the edge chain in the Evernym sovereign ecosystem are essentially digital wallets, which, as many have said, are the mobile device or phone for now. The agency layer is what we refer to it as at Evernym, which has other names, but is usually just a piece of software or some kind of cloud service that can either operate, a piece of software that either can operate locally at the edge, so in the device, or remotely in the cloud through a cloud service provider that basically allows for accessing and mediating data and transactions in that data when the person, say, for example, doesn't have access to their device. The device might be offline, you might lose reception, you might be sleeping. So all these things that might have to operate in the background while you're not actually able to be receiving notification and push requests to your mobile device and responding in real time. And then the third piece of the edge chain is what we call the micro ledger, which is effectively a peer-to-peer smaller ledger, right, that wouldn't be on the public blockchain, that's keeping an audit trail of some of these transactions. So those are sort of the three fundamental pieces of storage. As some of my co-panelists have mentioned, we're overly concerned, or sorry, not overly, but we are quite concerned with inclusivity, perhaps not overly. And hence my question earlier about, what about those that don't have either a sophisticated device, sufficient storage capacity, access to Wi-Fi at all times. And so Evernym is trying to build all of its products and services with the guiding principle of identity for all and inclusivity in mind. And that means we have to account for vulnerable populations, children, refugees, migrants, other individuals that might not have all sort of the high-tech device at their fingertips at all times. And that means you need to build in governance. You need to build in off-chain and non-technical solutions to questions around guardianship and how you can trust people that might be helping manage your identity services, including your keys, right? Because key management is one of the biggest challenges that we have right now. So just want to put that issue on the table as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's one of the things that were actually supposed to be in the first part, because what it all boils down to is public-private key infrastructure. And what blockchains enable is to have those decentralized for the very first time. And then what it another time boils down to is how do you manage them? How do you securely create the entropy to generate them? And how do you actually bring people into power to actually kind of create them, manage them, control them, revoke them, whatever kind of things around this whole usability question here. And I think your point is very, very good in terms of if we talk about self-sovereign identity, we assume people with like the most like complex new smartphones, and even those don't have the sophisticated crypto chips to generate high-level entropy that is sophisticated enough to provide secure key infrastructure. So when we think of government services and eIDAS conform self-sovereign identity infrastructure that should be there in the future, we have to think about how can you provide people with hardware that is secure enough. And I think that brings us down to this kind of example from earlier on where we had these cards from Estonia, where we have this amazing example from Germany that has one of the best cryptographically e-identity cards that is used by no one because it's too good. But the whole thing here is that the cryptography in it is really, really good, and the cryptography in your smartphone is not. So unless we actually tackle this, unless we find ways to incentivize the industry of hardware producers to bring this stuff into our phones, we have to go through other kind of means like hardware wallets, like we see them in crypto in the terms of like cryptocurrencies and how we store them and manage them. Or we have to just accept that high levels of trust and like really e-government services and interactions will not be possible with self-sovereign identities if we actually take them serious. So that's just one kind of future question that we really have to solve to make this thing relevant on a government.
Sorry. Yeah, I think just maybe to add on this, I think we're battling like a certain trade-off. I think we have there's cards and so on, they don't have a display. So how do you actually know that you can trust it? Because then you need another device. If you don't think the mobile phone is the trustworthy device in the beginning, which is, I think, the only tool most of people have access to in the world, for now at least, if you need to have something on a data center, like in the cloud, that's great because you can have, for us, like you have multiple devices and you can use it on all the different devices. The challenge is then you need to trust someone else to operate that. So if it's a hosted, cloud-based thing, who is operating them? And who's paying for that for the people who might not be able to afford it? So it's, I'm not saying, I think where we are today is like the start. I think this will be many years until we have figured some of the things out. Our hypothesis that the chips become fast, cheaper, that there's a lot of things, until we have figured out a few basic things, that mobile phones will be better and more accessible and cheaper. But that's only one part. We're also working on the cloud side. So I'm just throwing it out.
We'll go with Catherine, and then I want to pose a question to Carlos after that.
I mean, if we're positing that we should be using mobile phones for identity, are you saying that governments should start issuing mobile phones to everybody so that everyone has an identity? Because in today's world, the government manages our identities. So what happens now? And the other point you mentioned, which I think is very interesting, what is the break even? What is the business case for this that actually says here, yes, it's enough value for us to pay for it. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think it's
I think it's fair. I think where we are today, I don't think, like, many people have mobile phones today. I don't think that we will, like, what we are building at the moment is not what I suggest next year will be the identity solution for government services immediately. I think we're experimenting. We have started certain pilots in certain countries, but it's a long way to go. So there's a lot of questions around how key management works, how do we do custodian, like many open questions. I think we get some traction now, but it's still experimentational. At some point, many people, that's the device people use today for most of their private data. Like, if you open someone's phone, that's the most precious thing people have, and the thing they actually carry around with them all the time. We talked about smart cards, and you use them once a year for your tax. Oh, you forgot your password, of course, because you never use it. So you write it on, and the security starts or gets loose somewhere else. I think in many countries, a mobile phone might be a sufficiently good alternative. There will be places where you can go if you have no mobile phone, where you can have a card and you get go to a branch of a bank or wherever, or to a post office, which could give you access to certain of the services. I think you can work around this, but at the moment, let's start fixing it for, at least from our perspective, for some million of people. Let's see that works, and then we go to the edge cases. And that's not being exclusive of the population. It's more like, let's prove the concept first before we solve all the edges.
Thank you. And so, Carlos, you're with Alastria, and you mentioned earlier that it's a consortium.
Sorry.
Okay, now you're getting a different question. Yes. So what I was saying is, you mentioned that you have a consortia of, I believe you said, public, private, academic, research. I mean, fantastic. You mentioned there's over 270 entities, and your big focus is on identity because it crosses over so many things. How are you addressing things that the other panelists have been talking about on a larger scale to satisfy the needs of all of those types of people's goals with identity and provide storage solutions?
About the scalability of the network, we don't think that there is a problem. We have chosen a consensus protocol that allows for more than a block a second, so it's enough for the time being. And talking about the storage, we are going to start for the first version with a mobile phone storing the personal data. On the blockchain, we're going to store only hashes and in a very specific way that avoids correlation between the identity of the person and allows not only registering the hash of the attribute, but also allows for a number of operations like revoking attestment, revoking claims, and deleting, making sure that everybody that has got some information about you is obliged to revoke the information, to delete the information, sorry.
And so is this this from input from the consortium that is kind of like a creative and mind share to put this together, or is this like a proprietary system being built and then it's pushed out to them?
Well, the nodes are going to be run by the members of the consortia. Everybody is allowed to enter the consortium, so it's public in the sense that anybody can join, but it's identified in the sense that you have to be well known to have identified to be a part of the consortium, no anonymous members. Then the whole blockchain is run by the members, not by the consortia itself. And the working, for example, in identities is being done by volunteering people that is, volunteering on his own time, or people that is, their companies allow to work for the consortium for a period of time. For example, myself, I'm working more than half of my time for the identity group. I'm leading the identity group. And there is around 90 people being part of that identity group, lawyers, technical people, and user interface designer, the user experience specialist, and well, the whole set of people that has to be part of that.
Thank you. And I'd like to offer the opportunity, if anyone else on the panel would like to add something related to some of the challenges or solutions of or preferred storage options. Storage options.
When you're speaking too loud, then it just like disconnects.
Sorry, it's kind of an American thing. I'll try to be quiet.
Stand further from the microphone.
Anyone else?
So I just wanted to kind of add to what a lot of the panelists have said. We've talked a lot about mobile phones, and are we kind of entering a future where, oh, if you don't own a certain mobile phone with biometric security, you're not going to be able to join into the digital revolution? And yesterday, I spent all day with several different departments of the Dutch government. We were talking about what is my data and what is actually not my data. For example, your first name and last name, technically it is part of your data, but it's also the government's data. The reason your name is what it is because the government is kind of upholding it and telling everyone else it is. So we're getting in this area where, for example, like healthcare and health records, is it purely your data or not? Now, with the digital identity, you don't need directly maybe the mobile device to access it. For example, someone that could come from let's say a refugee example, or a disaster zone where they've lost the ability to, or lost their personal possessions, they can still identify themselves to one of the authority, for example, UNICEF or Red Cross, by saying that, this is my public key, this is my data, I can verify that I own this identity, and by that, they can pull down the records they need, for example, to provide the right medicine, the right kind of healthcare, relocation services. So, sure, mobile phones are definitely going to play a massive key role in moving forward, but there are ways to kind of move around it, and I think it's our responsibility when we look at digital identities to ensure that we think about that too, to try and figure out where can we fit it into other solutions that make it more accessible for other individuals.
All right, thank you. So I'd like to put one last comment on this whole question of storage, and that really boils down to how the networks are actually being set up and run. And we see a lot of consortia evolving around this. If it's not just like a blockchain run by one single company, which I would say like rules out most of the kind of public contexts that are not like just corporation based. And what we have to have in mind here is that each of these networks, if it's a blockchain network that is somehow decentralized, relies on some way of incentivizing users to join. And it has to be very clear for which incentives people join such an identity network or a network that is facilitated for providing identities, because this is a public utility and this is a really sensible, very important public utility that has to be provided, and that has to be provided in a way that is actually understandable, trustable, and somehow, at least for now, bulletproof and future provable in order to actually work, especially in the government context. Like, just really to kind of repeat this, because what we see in current consortia, and this is not directly kind of pointing to anyone on the panel, but it's just kind of a general concern, is that the starting incentives for people to initially join this might be research and development, might be general interest in blockchain, might be facilitating one or two use cases in the company. But like, one of the principles of self-sovereign identity is that it should actually be there for your whole life, and you should be able to rely on it. And if the network that the whole thing is based on has no clear structure or no understandable incentive structure that allows it to actually be there as long as you are, you should not trust your identity to it. So really looking into how the network is set up and how the basic structures of identity are incentivized, and which kind of biases might exist within this, is a very important point to actually take into account. Particularly with consortia that are built for identity, because they are kind of, really like modeled into that direction. With a public blockchain like Bitcoin or Ethereum, if you use it for identity, and I don't say that this is the best solution, but you know that people run the network for really clear reasons. You might not agree with those reasons, but you know they do. And you can see that with Bitcoin for the last 10 years. But if you have something else that is set up particularly for the identity use case and is not provided by the state or the European Union, just to give an example of who a trusted actor could be, then you really have to give it a deep dive into how is this whole thing incentivized or not.
Hitesh or Elizabeth, did you have anything briefly to add?
So I just want to say something about value add that was mentioned there, right? So we've seen that once you have an identity, you can do a lot of things, and e-voting is something that's been mentioned. Passwords, we all have long lists of passwords, right? We need to remember these things. They get lost, they need to be changed and all the rest of it. Well, once you have like an identity on the blockchain with a public key associated with it, well, you can have two-factor authentication, right? Which can be done directly from your mobile phone. The other thing is that we've had all this thing about fake news, about people abusing others on social media. Well, if you have an identity and you use that identity to log in to each of those systems, well, then we know who you are. And if you do misbehave, we do have the ability to maybe revoke that identity. So identity is so key that once you have that, all these other value adds do come along. So you have to build infrastructure, you have to maybe allow for government agencies to fund that infrastructure, but once that's there, the value add comes at a later date.
Kai, I love your enthusiasm. And after Elizabeth, we're going to take a few questions from the audience. And then, Catherine's going I just okay.
I'll try if this one works. Okay, so two things. A last point I wanted to make on storage was, unfortunately, I think what happens to every tech company, which has happened with every new technology, is eventually, whether it's the phone, mobile device, smart card, whatever it is, that there's always political pressure for a backdoor, right? And I think that's just something that's never going to go away. And so whatever, it doesn't even matter often what you use as the at the ledger level, but if you're using an interface that's still vulnerable to the same pressures it's always been vulnerable to, I think you have to account for that. On the piece around, someone earlier in that presentation made the point around, people should not even recognize that blockchain is running in the background. So I think all of this is going to come to the stage where really the UX UI has to be such that it is completely invisible to the end user. And I think that will build trust in, I think as long as you have these asymmetries of information and asymmetries around technology and sophistication and, the ability to access things that aren't mediated, that don't require, custodial solution or someone sitting in the middle, you're going to have that unfair sort of advantage. And so once we level that playing field and it becomes like the internet and the web where it's completely seamless to the end user, I think we're at a point of potential adoption there. The other point that I was going to make was around, going back to the point around verifiable credentials. I think one thing that's really important to understand is one of the questions we didn't address around it was the adoption, kind of the stage of have these been deployed on mass scale. And I think that we're still at the stage where we're trying to write the schema, which will become the field. So a birth date looks like this, and it has day, month, and year. And then how do you use that in a specific context? So if you have a context that's heavily regulated, so you have financial regulations that apply in a banking setting or payment setting, or if you're in a healthcare context and you've got healthcare specific regulations, how do you sort of build credential definitions on top that reference those schema that are interoperable but still account for the unique needs of the specific ecosystem that you're in? And so I think those are some of the challenges, healthcare in particular being a very challenging one that many people have pointed out today. But there are certainly a host of others, and I think it's important to keep sight of how the regulatory legal layer there impacts the adoption of the technology apart from the standards themselves.
Thank you. We're going to go just before Catherine. We're going to go for a few questions. Give the panelists a breather here for a second. I think I saw a few people with their hands up. Over here, sir.
Hi, Alan Third from the Knowledge Media Institute in the UK. I was slightly concerned when you were saying about not having anonymity on social media, and we can track and see what you do. And I totally get that for stopping the abusive trolls. but there are many situations where public anonymity is a good thing. I mean, we're assuming people are living in open even here, if people want to talk about sensitive subjects like, I don't know, sexual assault or something, they don't necessarily want to speak in public. So it's important not to get carried away and say, oh, we've got this technology that if we implement it right, we can end public anonymity and stop all this abuse, when in fact we could also enable other forms of abuse. And it be a bit more careful about that.
Yeah, so I'm kind of thinking when I think about these sort of things is kind of like the green bar that you have in a HTTPS connection. So if you're getting news from a certain organization, you want to know that is not fake news, maybe, right? So that's sort of thing I'm thinking about. So there's going to be identifiable players in this space who will use their e-identity to log in, and we know that this is a certified individual that's actually delivering this information to us. And as usual, there will be people who will not want to be known on the system, and they'll remain anonymous. So that's the way I view the world on this one. Well, yeah. So yeah, but it would definitely prevent things like fake news and things like that on social media.
Yeah, so actually, I'm very glad you actually brought that up. I agree. I think, for example, like LinkedIn or even potentially now Facebook, it could help verifying your accounts, verifying that you add the right person, that you add the right work contacts, that you are actually talking to a real person. Something we also thought about was more personal dating websites. There are certain websites out there where anonymity is very much appreciated, but you want to still make sure that you meet someone that is real and you don't get catfished, right? How do you verify your account and verify your profile without giving your data over? So that is something we actually worked on for quite a while. It's a very interesting case study.
Zero.
Can I take it back to e-identity? Oh, it was a follow-up on that, but in the context of government services, since I think that's one of the questions here. So I think in the context of government services, what's interesting is that the objective is often, it has very little to do with the identity. It's not so much that we know that you're Joe Smith, it's that we know, that's the worst example, John Smith, it's that very American, sorry, it's that we know we want to cut down on fraud, waste, and abuse. And we want to cut down on fraud, waste, and abuse by saying that the same resources aren't being, double allocated or double spent. We want to make sure that people that are entitled to things are receiving them, they have access. And so it doesn't actually really matter who you are, it's sort of the net reconciliation across an economy, whether it's, intra-EU, cross-border, within one member state. And so what's really interesting there is if we do get to those advances, it really is, someone said, as a joke, zero knowledge, everything. But to the extent where it's less about the means and more about the end state and the objective, I think is really where we have to focus our attention. Is that I agree that there's so many situations where you want to remain anonymous and that you should have the right to remain so if it's not relevant to the objective, right? So if it's not relevant, particularly where there's an aggregate goal in mind, then I think that it's absolutely a key point that we shouldn't lose sight of, and we shouldn't force everyone to always be raising.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm butting in here. Sorry. I think there's a couple of points here that really kind of worried me. Firstly, when you're talking about self-sovereign identity, you seem to be talking about it as being taken off the government and being handed into the hands of corporations, which means effectively you're talking about corporation as government, which really actually, no, but that's what you said. You were talking about economic incentives to keep the network running. The whole point of government is occasionally we accept inefficiencies because it means that people are protected. I mean, just because we have technology doesn't mean we get rid of government. And I think you're actually, talking about incentive mechanisms on a token or an ICO. So often we have people coming into our center, and when we do the economic analysis, they have basically run off and they've done a bunch of stuff on technology, and the markets will tend towards zero, which means that your tokens just are valueless, which means everyone leaves your network. Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to ask the panelists in your wonderful enthusiasm to let me try to help make sure everybody balances it out. You can take your seatbelt off now. She was about to jump out of the chair.
I would just like to say that I fully agree with what you said. So there's no, like, maybe there was a problem of actually communicating this, but I fully agree that bringing in economic incentives in a public infrastructure is a very, very bad idea, especially in this one. So I think I'm fully aligned with what your concerns are.
So I would like to, is it me? Oh, it is me. Okay. I think I've solved it. I'm just going to add something in here to completely change everyone's thought for just a second. About 2 weeks ago, I was invited to the United Nations Blockchain for Impact, and as part of that day, they had a large breakout session on identity. And I was really lucky that that was 2 weeks ago, because what I learned is we could have a 6-week conference on this topic, and we might not all leave completely fulfilled. So all these conversations are great, and I would like to, the European Union Blockchain Forum has a specific goal to try to get some things done with e-identity related to blockchain. So if you don't mind, I'll ask your permission if I can continue on through some of the slides with the panelists and your questions. So the next thing is kind of interesting because I'm not really sure if everyone in the room knows what this means. So we've talked about the individual person with the first circle, the personal identity, personal data set, moving on to where should that be stored, how should that be stored, and now we're talking about certificate signatories. So these are things such as government agencies, post offices, private companies. In this context, Ken, are you referring to like attesters in that? Could you give us some more insight there?
Definitely. Also, I think there's a typo on the slide. So the question to the panelists is, if we want attestations, we need institutions to certify the information. Who could be those institutions, and what real-life examples are there already of such institutions providing digital certificates to citizens?
Yeah, so I think there are already like multiple entities to do this. I think whether it's a bank, post office and others, or telcos who know lots about you are obviously like easy targets, or like government entities. So we were running one pilot in Zug where the government, so the individuals, they created their own self-sovereign identity, went to the registration office, they verified their passport and issued a credential to the user. And the users now can use them on e-services. So they go basically to a portal and not only show this is my identity, but also have now a signed piece of data from the government, or like in this case from the city registration office, that they have been there in person and have been validated. And that was the starting point, and now the government is now playing with different integrations on their side. But what happened is, I think, interesting, and I think that's also like, I think as an innovation concept, cool. They started with this, made that public, and now in the last few months, many different companies have actually started to build on top of that. So we had now an e-voting thing a few weeks ago where people experimented. Last week, people contacted us of like, hey, we built a unlocking your bike in the city now, in Zurich and in Zug, with that identity. So you increase the trust that this is not just a random phone number. So you have a little different trust level. It's not something you can do for like proper voting, but it's something like you start with something, I don't know, someone gives something valuable to a user, and then you have like all these kind of like niche use cases and small things people can do with this. Today, people are using Facebook for so many services already. Nobody thought about this when it started in Harvard with a few people, but because it's something which grew and people trust this. And I think if you go to the US, people just trust Google a lot. It's crazy, but it is what they do. In Europe, people trust the government more than they trust companies. And in other parts of the world, they trust more other individuals. So we talk a lot about like peer-to-peer attestations, like who can you trust? It can be whatever the tribe chef or the doctor in the village. Who knows? I think there's just many different concepts we might not think about on a day-to-day basis.
Well, in our cases, any member of the consortium can certify attributes for persons, and at the beginning, and probably later on we will allow people to certify things about other people to make it more open. But we include also some the level of assurance or level of, that you can the confidence that you can have on that certifying. This could allow, if you know the certifier, to just have confidence on the information, or ask for another certification from another that you can have confidence on. But the level, as will be standardized, will for easy transactions will make it easier. For very important transactions, you only will have confidence on certain members, official members, or big companies, or whatever. It is up to you as the receiver of the information. And it's the person who chooses what certification presents to the service provider. Always the user is in the center and have to select everything.
Yeah, building on that, so what happens now online is that your data can be used cross-contextually, but not by you. So people who have your data will use your data for marketing, for insurance quotes. They'll use it however they will, in whatever context they will. In the real world, it's the opposite, right? It's you can kind of use things that were not purpose-built to prove your identity or your age or your dress, but you can use them for that purpose. So you can take, your driver's license to get into a bar, or you can take a collection of documents to open a bank account. What we're trying to do is kind of reverse the paradigm and create digitally what we have in the real world, where you can accrue this sort of social capital, reputational capital, trust, and literally deposit them into your own self-sovereign bank account of data, where you can use that cross-contextually on your terms rather than the way that it works now. So I think it's really that's the paradigm shift that we're trying to build in self-sovereign identity. It's not that the corporation or the government owns your identity, it's that you're leveling that playing field, and equally the entity and the legal entities and organizations are also authenticating themselves to you. So that is also a leveling mechanism where, instead of just having to authenticate yourself to your bank or to the whatever government agency you're phoning, they also have to prove that they are who they say that they are. And so you end up with a situation that's much more equitable in the end.
To complete the photo, when you present a claim, there's a number of attributes. You also include the date where the beginning of the first date and the end date, and then the purpose of for sharing the information. So the receiver of the information is only allowed to use the information for that purpose.
Kind of like, I think we always, like, on the technical level, you can do so many things, and like things are broken and so on, but we need to compare where we are today. So I live in the US at the moment. I take a photo of a utility bill as a proof where I live. I send a PDF of an account statement to someone to trust me that I have a certain income. Yeah, I think we kind of forgot in the last 20 years that the technology of every individual is so empowered to fake their whatever certificate of their MBA or what university, and it's still something which works in our real world. And I can print something out, and people believe that's true. And it's I think what Elizabeth said, like this paradigm shift of like we already moved into a new world, and we have kind of forgotten to move that element. We trust on paper, we trust on ink, and a PDF in an email is great. That's where we are.
So we've heard a lot about self-sovereign IDs, and I'm a strong and firm believer that there's going to be more than one type of ID system out there. There's not going to be one single ID. We're not all going to run around with for example, an EU ID. There's going to be a few for different use cases. There might be one specifically for healthcare, might be one for your social presence with your friends and family, etc. What I see is that if you want to build an identity that really opens up doors, that really gives you access to services, to travel, to immigration, to opening a bank account, financial services, you need trust. And we were talking about certificates and certificate standards. Now, there's only one internationally recognized document that allows you to travel and identify yourself no matter where you're in the world, and that's the passport. Now, the passport did not come around because the UN or the League of Nations back then, or the EU or anyone actually said, let's put this into legislation. It was the International Civil Aviation Organization that said that. Because there was just a massive increase of travel, and we needed a standard machine-readable document that respected in every single nation. And that is what set the paradigm for the next 40 years, and we're still living with the passport. We don't have now that digital version. We're now living in a world where we're hitting that same problem that the international aviation, the air travel industry hits, where everyone was flying around everywhere, goods and travel and services was exploding, and they needed something to fix it. Now, that is what's happening in digital space. We are shopping online, texting online, we're calling online. Everything is like 60-70% of our lives are taking place online. And we need that paradigm shift. And I think the only body that is going to be able to issue an ID that works in this digital space completely is the governments that we trust in. Because those are the only ones that allow us to be trusted no matter in what jurisdiction we are. So yes, self-sovereign IDs are fantastic for certain use cases, such as, as the uPort, it's fantastic for a municipal level, and the innovation it encourages in the city is fantastic. But when we look at a global scale, something that works for everyone, we really need to think about who our trusted partners are in this kind of community. And that comes back to the governments and the governments that we trust.
Thank you. Moving on to Hitesh.
Yeah, just to add to that. So the biggest cost in trying to establish an identity for a person is maybe for them to go in person to a government agency and present a passport and so on and so forth, right? So I have to agree, we could have multiple identities here. You could have an identity at work. So your employer knows lots about you. If you had some sort of a portal at work, they would be able to issue an identity for you. That will allow you to do business on their behalf, log into their systems and so on and so forth. And if you needed a government agency identity, then you'd get one as well, right? But the cost is going to be huge if we have to identify each and every citizen. So the easiest and the quickest way to do this has to be online. We have to think of online mechanisms whereby the government already knows huge amounts of information about you. You can log into a portal and somehow get an identity online. The minute you decide to say, well, everybody has to present themselves in person, that's a huge cost, right?
But I think that's not that complicated. I think it came up as trust. What do you trust? Like if you have already multiple services, you have a bank, let's say at least many people in the European Union, they have a bank account, where you can log into your bank and you register, instead of your email address, you register as well your digital identity. And then you go to your telco and you register as well your identity. And all of them are issuing now statements to you as a user. And now I'm in control of statements from my university, from my bank, and from my telco. And this package is something I can now present to someone in a digitally provable way. That's very powerful, because your identity is really the aggregation of your transactions in the world. It's not this one ID card given from one entity. And I think that's just a different concept to think about identity.
Fully agree. I think that both views are correct. So we can use some certification from any company, any part of the government, and for some things we need official certification. But if we have a single identity that can combine both, we can, for the user, it's much more easier than if you have to have the different identities for several things. The important thing is that even if you have a single identity, you can share just the parts of your identity that you want with whoever it is, even to anonymity. So if you don't share any attribute, but you share your identity, that is a single identifier, you are still anonymous for that person, for that company that you want to share any information. And for other companies or for the other person, you can share as much as you want. So it's a question of keeping the user in control of who is shared, for who, for which purpose, and for what period of time. And having always the ability to withdraw that consent. So the consent should be explicit and should be an easy way, as easy as the consent, to withdraw the consent.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
No, just that the identity solution should allow not just for the consent, but for the withdrawal of the consent too.
Thank you, Carlos. We're going to now come full circle, literally, and this is going to maybe be a more challenging question, I'm not sure. So we're going to talk about, in the context of e-identity and what we've spoken about in the ecosystem, what transactions are written in the blockchain, if any? Now, if we were all in complete consensus of exactly how this should be done, then you'd have some really easy answers. But we have some people believing in self-sovereign identity, some people not believing in it, some believe, as Ken mentioned, different countries, even within the EU, I'm sure, have different trust levels of government, but we're still going to ask the question of the panel. So what transactions are written in the blockchain, if any? How do we do this without compromising personal data? And how does it all work utilizing blockchain, being that we're at the blockchain forum? And I'm going to ask everybody to, give a brief answer and then just dialogue back and forth. So I'm going to start with Elizabeth.
I guess I have a very strong point of view on this. My personal point of view is you minimize the transactions that are written to the ledger. So it's only the absolutely necessary transactions that are truly transactional and not so interactional. So just preventing the double spend problem. I think to be truly self-sovereign, it should depend on the individual. There might be individuals that want every single transaction written to the ledger. There might be ones that don't want anything they don't want a digital footprint. They don't want a, chain print or whatever you call it now. But I think that would be the truly self-sovereign approach. I think the problem is to implement that at scale. You have to sort of take a position one way or the other. And then obviously I am also biased because I'm a data protection privacy lawyer. So.
So we use it. We use the blockchain for two main specific reasons. Number one is to ensure that once you've been verified by a government or an authority trusted partner, that everyone else in the community can be able to see that you have indeed been verified. This is to allow, for example, SMEs and other companies the ability to now verify their customers. Immigration officers to verify who you are a lot quicker. So that's the transparency part of it. But now if you're sending your data to someone else, let's say a company, you might not want the company that records go up, for example, that you flew British Airways or you flew KLM or any other airline. You might not want everyone to know that piece of information. But for our perspective, we still want an audible trail that you have shared data with them. So when you do come around to revoking access to your data, and if they refused or didn't comply, you as a user now have concrete evidence saying that, well, I did share my data with them, and I did revoke my data access, and they didn't comply. Because today, it's very easy to say to a company, please delete my data, and they say, we did it. Or for example, oh, we don't have any of your data. We've all seen that example in the last month or two, certain companies saying they don't have our data. And it's very hard to prove anywise. It's very hard to say anything else. So what we do is we obscure basically the record. So only the two individuals, the individual and the company that is transacting, know the transaction has taken place. But the user is still able to basically identify this transactional record of saying, this was my transaction with ABC company. So verification and auditing, that is the only reasons we use blockchain.
I would strongly disagree and very much agree with Elizabeth, but actually try to kind of reconcile these two views. So when we bring it down to what we started with, which is the DID spec, which is essentially how you manage keys and how you're enabled to actually sign everything. And everything you get is signed by someone else. So there is no need to bring transactions to the blockchain to prove that you had them happen. What you need is to have a registry where somebody provides the fact that they have an identity they use to sign stuff. And that's what has to go in the blockchain. Everything else doesn't need to be on the blockchain, because if you have your storage, be it a web storage or be it your wallet, where you can prove that somebody at a certain point in time signed something as a transaction or basically as a transfer of information to you and with you, you have all the audit trails you need. You don't need a blockchain for that. by that, you actually have a much better situation for your privacy situation, for your security situation, and also the whole question of how long is this infrastructure that you currently use for storing the keys and making your identity available going to be secure? I mean, today we heard from IBM that whatever we look at right now as being secure might not be secure in 10 years, 5 years, 20 years from now. So thinking about the whole question of this has to manage identity for us, the least possible amount of data has to be there.
Yeah, maybe just I agree on the with Kai and Elizabeth. We are now experimenting with one step further. So you create your identity and you don't put anything on the blockchain, not even that. So that is something which only works if you go to your bank and it's like, hey, this is my identity, and here's the keys associated with this one. And now the bank can issue me statements about myself, and I can use them because I have the key, I have the identifier, and the statement from the bank is issued to this identifier, and I hold the keys for that. And that's consistent in itself without touching any blockchain. And only in the moment when you actually need to revoke it, or you have something, it was compromised, then I go and write something on the blockchain. And that allows now a verifier, with like, they receive my credentials or my attestations with my key, and that's consistent, it works. They will also check on the blockchain, is there a revocation, like has there been something happened to that? Then they will say, oh wait, that's not anymore valid. So we're experimenting with like minimizing it to an extreme to have privacy, costs, and other reasons, like in terms of scalability. There's a lot of, I think, interesting innovations at the moment happening.
So just to go back to the blockchain, right? The blockchain is immutable, right? So you don't want to put any data that will be updated at a later point. So everything really needs to be stored off-chain. And once you have the identity on the blockchain, you can link to a KYC store on which all your documents could be encrypted and signed by you. So you can have all of these signatories on these documents. So you can then have a Kerberos-like mechanism whereby you can have a full audit trail of issuing a token to some company to say, hey, you can access my KYC documents, and these are the documents you can access, and they can present that token to the service, and the service can give those documents to that person. So you have a full audit trail, right? So you don't want to store anything on the blockchain apart from very minimal information, and in my mind, that is just a public key cert and no more. And the revocation mechanism in the blockchain comes for free because of the fact that if you lose your cert, you just get another one. So you have one cert on block 253 and one cert on block 500. Because the way the blockchain works, you always go top down and you will always hit the latest cert, right? So certification revocation comes for free on the blockchain.
Two last questions from the audience, and then we...
Okay. One moment, please.
We need to stop now. So
Okay.
there's a burning question from the audience.
Okay, two people didn't respond to this. Can I give them a minute each? Okay. Okay, so we're going to, two of the panelists haven't responded to this question yet. We're going to let them respond, and then we're going to do audience questions. So Carlos, did you want to chime in?
Yes, please. Well, I think that we all agree on minimizing the information on the blockchain because it's sensible. But at the same time, we want to keep some very basic functionality that is mainly revocation or deletion or asking for deletion of the information. So I think that is good to register on the blockchain the consent and the purpose of the consent. If not, if you give some data and it's not registered in the blockchain, the service provider can use that data without linking to the purpose. If you have the hash of both things in the blockchain, you can demonstrate to whoever that you provide that information only for a purpose and for a given period of time. And at the same time, if you register on the blockchain that you have you want to withdraw the consent, there is a mechanism to inform everybody, the service provider that has received the information, that he should remove immediately that information unless they have legitimate reasons to keep that information for a period of time. So we think that the functionality of revocation and ask for erasure of the information is basic for giving an easy way to fulfill all the requirements under the GDPR. So GDPR is very aligned with SSI. I think that we think that it is not to be considered as an enemy of blockchain. We have to use blockchain to find a better way to fulfill all the requirements of GDPR, and we think that is possible. We have an initial implementation of that solution. We invite everybody to check it and try to help us. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're doing something a little bit different. We're sort of leaving data where it is, but merely allowing companies or third parties to link using our identities. And the point of that is that if someone revokes their permissions to those third parties, they just lose the link automatically. So they can't even access the data. And the idea is that they would never actually ever have a copy of that data in the first place. But obviously what we're doing is research, so it's much more experimental, and what we've been trying to do is look at creating an IP address for data, basically.
I would like to say that I think we've had a lot of good discussion, and thank you everyone for participating. It turns out that we just don't have time for questions, but what I would like to do is to just reintroduce the names and the companies of the panelists in case you wish to engage further with them. So down on the end, we have Rouven Heck from uPort, Elizabeth Renieris from Evernym. I'm going to go so I can see everybody. Okay, Hitesh Tewari from University College in Dublin. Kai Wagner, got it right this time. Jolocom, and also works quite heavily with Germany. Carlos Pastor, the Alastria, the consortium, William Skannerup from VeridenKey, and Catherine Mulligan from Imperial College and another college, right?
UCL, yeah.
UCL. So let's thank all of our panelists for a robust and very informative conversation.